Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 27. Civil Wars under the reign of Theodosius. This chapter recounts the turbulent final years in which the Roman Empire was still nominally whole, a period marked by civil wars, fragile rulers, and the imposing figure of Theodosius, the last man to govern the East and West with undivided authority. It is a story of youthful emperors undone by circumstance, of generals whose ambition exceeded their loyalty, and of an empire whose political and religious tensions foreshadowed its eventual fragmentation. The narrative opens with Gratian, a prince whose early virtues had invited high hopes. Gentle, affable, a friend to scholars and a favorite of the clergy, he seemed destined for an illustrious reign. Yet his character, shaped within the curated environment of court tutors and admiring courtiers, lacked the resilience that adversity alone can produce. As he matured, the polished qualities admired in boyhood deteriorated into hesitation and dependency. He increasingly favored a circle of companions who gratified his tastes rather than stabilized his rule. Under this weakened leadership, the Western Empire grew restless, and the army, long the arbiter of Roman politics, became susceptible to rebellion. From Britain emerged Maximus, a usurper who marched swiftly into Gaul, where Gratian's own troops abandoned him. The young emperor fled and was murdered shortly after, his promising reign ending in humiliation and violence. Theodosius, who governed the eastern provinces, now stood as the empire's senior figure. Elevated to the purple by Gratian years earlier, he had been chosen precisely because the East required a leader with military competence and firm judgment. With Gratian gone and the boy emperor Valentinian II endangered, Theodosius found himself morally and politically compelled to intervene. Yet before describing the conflict, the chapter lingers on his character. Theodosius appears as a man of contradictions. Generous and approachable, a lover of family and friends, courageous in battle, and yet inclined toward religious severity and occasional indolence. He embraced Christianity with fervor, supporting orthodoxy with the full weight of imperial authority. Still, he possessed a magnanimity that would distinguish him from his rivals. The First Civil War ignited when Maximus pressed into Italy, driving Valentinian II and his mother into exile in the East. Their plight stirred Theodosius, whose sense of honor was further deepened by his affection for Valentinian's sister, whom he later married. He assembled a vast army of Eastern legions, supported by Gothic auxiliaries, Huns, and Alans, peoples whose mastery of mounted archery made them powerful allies. His march toward the west displayed strategic brilliance. While Maximus attempted to fortify his position, he lacked both the nerve and the skill to withstand a determined offensive. Defeated near Aquileia, Maximus was captured and executed, his brief reign extinguished as swiftly as it had risen. Theodosius's victory could have justified the annexation of the Western Empire under his sole rule. Instead, he restored Valentinian II to his rightful throne in Milan, refusing even the appearance of self-interested ambition. This act, striking for its restraint, won him admiration in an age accustomed to ruthless political seizures. For a moment, the restored harmony between the two courts seemed to promise renewed stability. That prospect soon faded. Justina died, and Valentinian, still young and lacking firmness, became entangled in court rivalries and ill-chosen friendships. His position weakened until one day he was found dead, strangled according to the most credible accounts. Though officially declared a suicide, his death bore the unmistakable mark of assassination. the shadow of guilt fell upon Arbogast, the Frankish general who effectively commanded the Western army and wielded real authority behind the throne. Arbogast, for all his power, understood that his barbarian birth made his ascension to the throne impossible. Thus, he turned to Eugenius, a rhetorician of respectable learning and character, raising him to the purple in hopes of ruling through him. Eugenius, while personally moderate, soon became the figurehead for an aristocratic revival of pagan sentiment in Rome, alarming both clergy and the Eastern court. Theodosius, still grieving Valentinian, and urged by his wife to avenge the young emperor, resolved to march once more. This second civil war was waged not only for political unity, but also for religious supremacy in an empire where theological passion often burned hotter than patriotism. Theodosius advanced again with a diverse army whose most formidable elements were the Gothic troops he relied upon, though he viewed them with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The decisive confrontation occurred at the river Frigidus, where Eugenius and Arbogast chose a defensible mountain position. The first day was catastrophic for Theodosius. Thousands of Goths perished in a valiant but ill-fated assault, their bodies littering the passes. The emperor, exhausted and surrounded, spent a grim night contemplating defeat. Yet his spirit, strengthened by faith and a certain stoic acceptance of fortune's caprice, endured. At dawn, the battle turned. A gust of wind, celebrated by Christian observers as providential, blew violently against the shields of Eugenius's troops, driving dust into their eyes and bending their missile weapons off course. Seizing this reversal, Theodosius ordered a fresh advance. Panic spread in the enemy ranks and the defenses crumbled. Eugenius was captured and executed. Arbogast fled into the mountains and took his own life. The West was once again united under Theodosius. After his victory, the emperor entered Italy in triumph, but the cost of unity had been heavy. His Gothic allies had been bled on the field of Frigidus, the Western government lay in disarray, and the empire's religious divisions were more entrenched than ever. Weary from years of campaigning, Theodosius returned to Milan with both his sons, Arcadius and Honorius. Soon after celebrating the games of the circus, he fell ill and died, leaving behind an empire that, though momentarily whole, was destined never again to know a single ruler. Thus ends the chapter with a sense of irreversible transition. Theodosius, the last to command a united empire, left his heirs a legacy of temporary peace but long-term fragility. The story of his civil wars illustrates not only his personal virtues and failings, but also the deep fractures, military, political, and religious, that ensured the Roman world would soon be divided forever. Chapter 28. Destruction of Paganism. In this chapter, the historian surveys one of the most remarkable transformations in the intellectual and spiritual history of humankind, the final and decisive overthrow of paganism in the age of Theodosius. What makes this event unique, he observes, is not merely the decline of an old religion, but its total extirpation, an extinction so complete that even the faintest embers of the ancient worship, once interwoven with the grandeur of Rome, were stamped out by imperial will and ecclesiastical zeal. The narrative unfolds as a portrait of a civilization abandoning the customs of its ancestors under the pressure of a new faith whose certainty left no room for rivals. The destruction of paganism did not occur in an instant, nor did it spring fully formed from the policies of Theodosius. Early Christian emperors such as Constantine and the elder Valentinian had adopted a cautious approach, allowing temples to stand, rites to continue, and vestiges of the old religion to exist under a mantle of tolerance. Their restraint, however, was not shared by the Christian clergy, who viewed every remaining altar as a stain upon the triumph of Christ. Among those most influential in stirring imperial conscience were Ambrose of Milan and his colleagues, whose unbending convictions shaped the religious temperament of Gratian and Theodosius. Under their guidance, Christian doctrine acquired a legal and political edge, supplying the emperors with arguments that framed pagan worship not as a harmless relic, but as an active crime against the majesty of the Creator and the dignity of the state. Two principles were established to justify coercion. First, that a magistrate becomes complicit in the crimes he fails to punish, and second, that idolatry, defined as the worship of false gods or demons, is the gravest of all offenses. Armed with these doctrines, the Christian rulers could now deem pagan rites not merely erroneous but criminal, and themselves obligated to suppress them. The laws of Moses and the stern examples of Hebrew kings were invoked, sometimes hastily and without regard for the gentler spirit of Christian teaching. Yet such appeals were persuasive to emperors who desired both to secure divine favor and to strengthen their political legitimacy. Until the late 4th century, Rome had maintained an elaborate and ancient hierarchy that governed its religious life. The colleges of priests, pontiffs, augurs, quindecimvirs, epilones, and flamens formed an intricate network of authority that oversaw rituals, divination, festivals, and the mysteries of the Sibylline books. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of the sacred flame, symbolized the continuity of the city itself. For nearly 1,000 years, these institutions had survived every political upheaval, from the monarchy to the republic to the Caesars. But now, as Christianity rose, the very foundations of Roman religious identity were exposed to unprecedented assault. Gratian struck the first decisive blow by refusing the title of Pontifex Maximus, thereby breaking a symbolic bond that had united emperor and priesthood since the time of Augustus. He removed the altar of victory from the Senate House and withdrew state funding for pagan rites. These measures, shocking to many senators, signaled that the old religion no longer enjoyed even ceremonial protection. Theodosius, endowed with an iron will and a fervent piety, advanced further. He enacted laws declaring sacrifices a capital offense, forbidding visits to temples, and stripping pagan priests of their privileges. The legal machinery of persecution, once the terror of Christians, was now turned upon the ancient cults that had governed the life of Rome. Yet the destruction of paganism was not solely a matter of legislation. It was also a spectacle of public zeal. Across the empire, temples were defaced, statues were toppled, and sacred groves were cut down. Many acts were carried out not by imperial officers, but by bishops and monks who interpreted the new laws as mandates for energetic action. In Egypt, the great Serapeum of Alexandria, a monumental shrine to the syncretic god Serapis, fell under the hammers of excited Christians. Its magnificent libraries, colonnades, and sculptures, treasures of ancient learning and art, were reduced to fragments. The fall of the Serapeum, as the historian notes, marked not merely the end of a temple, but the symbolic death of classical paganism itself. Even in Rome, where tradition held deeper roots, the process advanced steadily. Senators who still clung to the rights of their forefathers found themselves in a dwindling minority. The temples, deprived of government support and abandoned by worshippers who feared legal penalties, sank into decay. Some were converted into churches, others became quarries for marble and stone. The once venerated Vestals lost their privileges, and the sacred fire, believed to guarantee the city's safety, was extinguished forever. But the chapter does not dwell solely on the destruction of paganism. It proceeds to describe the parallel rise of new forms of Christian devotion that would shape medieval piety, the worship of saints and the veneration of relics. As the old gods vanished, the faithful sought tangible intercessors, martyrs whose bones, blood, or clothing were believed to possess miraculous power. Shrines sprang up across the empire, attracting pilgrims who hoped for healing or divine favor. This shift marked a profound transformation. The spiritual world of late antiquity was not emptied, but refilled with new objects of reverence. The cult of relics, though often dismissed by philosophers, carried intense emotional appeal. Bodies of saints were disinterred, divided, and distributed. Churches competed for the honor of possessing them. Miracles were attributed to these sacred fragments, further inflaming popular enthusiasm. The historian, with his characteristic irony, notes that Christians who had mocked pagans for worshipping idols now crowded to kiss bones and ashes, yet he acknowledges that such practices reflected the psychological needs of an age seeking reassurance amid political fragmentation and religious triumphalism. By the end of Theodosius's reign, the triumph of Christianity appeared absolute. paganism survived only in remote villages, obscure rituals, and nostalgic memories. Its philosophy lingered in the schools, but its religious structures lay shattered. Never before, the historian observes, had an ancient and widely practiced religion been extinguished so completely within so short a time. The transformation was not peaceful. It was the result of sustained legal pressure, clerical zeal, and the eagerness of a new ruling elite to purify the empire. Thus, the chapter closes on a reflection both solemn and revealing. The fall of paganism was not merely the collapse of temples or the ending of ceremonies. It signified the final departure of the classical world, the disappearance of a spiritual universe that had shaped Rome's laws, virtues, and imagination for centuries. In its place rose a new order, built upon the authority of bishops, the fervor of believers, and the conviction that truth permitted no rivals. And though the historian judges this revolution with a cool and critical eye, he recognizes it as one of the turning points in the great narrative of the empire's transformation. Chapter 29. Division of the Roman Empire between the sons of Theodosius. This chapter narrates the solemn and irreversible moment when the Roman Empire, still vast in its geography but diminished in its vigor, was divided between the two young sons of Theodosius. With the death of that pious and resolute emperor, the last ruler to hold undivided authority, the unity of Rome dissolved into separate eastern and western realms, foreshadowing the long decline that awaited both. The historian unfolds this moment with the gravity it deserves, observing that what had once been a single imperial machine began now to move in two divergent directions, each propelled by the ambitions of ministers, the intrigues of court eunuchs, and the weaknesses of child emperors who bore the purple without understanding its burdens. Theodosius's death left the empire in a fragile state. His elder son, Arcadius, inherited the east. His younger son, Honorius, received the west. Neither possessed the maturity nor the strength of character their father had displayed, and both were entrusted to guardians whose talents were overshadowed by ambition. While the division itself followed precedents set in earlier centuries, the historian underscores that this partition was more decisive and final than any before. Once rent in two, the empire would never again be rejoined under a single sovereign. Arcadius, scarcely 18, was placed under the influence of Rufinus, a minister whose pride and vanity were matched only by his insatiable thirst for power. In Constantinople, a city where the complex machinery of court politics thrived upon intrigue, Rufinus quickly emerged as the dominant personality. He aspired not merely to guide the emperor, but to rule in his stead, imagining that the young sovereign would remain forever pliant beneath his authority. The historian paints Rufinus as a man who understood the forms but not the spirit of governance, eager to display his grandeur in public but careless about the resentments he sowed among nobles, soldiers, and citizens alike. In the West, Honorius, still a child, was entrusted to Stilicho, a general of Vandal origin whose martial skill and personal integrity made him one of the last truly capable leaders Rome would ever know. Though technically a barbarian, Stilicho embodied virtues that the empire desperately needed: discipline, prudence, loyalty, and a clear understanding of the perils threatening both East and West. Yet the historian, with a trace of his characteristic irony, notes that such qualities were nearly fatal in a world that now feared and envied competence. Stilicho's authority, his noble marriage ties, and the affection he enjoyed among the troops made him both indispensable and suspicious in the eyes of rivals. It was Stilicho's claim that Theodosius, at his deathbed, had entrusted both empires to his guardianship. This assertion, whether genuine or invented, instantly placed him in conflict with Rufinus, for no minister in Constantinople would endure the thought of a Western general wielding influence over the East. The historian describes the resulting tension as a slow-burning feud, one that stretched from the halls of Constantinople to the plains of Thrace. Rufinus denounced Stilicho as an ambitious barbarian. Stilicho accused Rufinus of treachery and corruption. Between them, two young emperors, Arcadius and Honorius, served as passive instruments in a struggle they could neither control nor comprehend. The friction escalated when Stilicho marched eastward against the Goths under Alaric, who had risen in revolt shortly after Theodosius's death. Stilicho's presence at the head of a formidable army provoked suspicion in Constantinople. Rufinus feared that the Western general intended to seize power or even overthrow the government. In a dramatic moment of court intrigue, messengers were dispatched to order Stilicho to relinquish the eastern troops under his command. He complied, though reluctantly, recognizing that a direct confrontation would plunge the empire into civil war. But Stilicho's obedience foiled Rufinus rather than strengthened him. When the eastern troops returned to Constantinople, they brought with them a fierce resentment toward the minister who had deprived them of a competent leader. As Rufinus approached to receive them in ceremony, the soldiers, acting under the silent encouragement of their general, the Gothic-born Gaius, surrounded him. In a sudden and violent outburst, Rufinus was cut down before the palace gates, his ambitions extinguished in the very moment he believed himself secure. The historian remarks, with his familiar blend of irony and judgment, that Rufinus's fall was both the predictable reward of his arrogance and a grim reflection of the age's instability. Yet Rufinus's death did not restore unity or harmony. In the East, his place was taken by Eutropius, a eunuch whose talents were even narrower and whose vanity exceeded that of his predecessor. Court eunuchs, long mistrusted for their manipulative instincts, now found themselves governing an empire that had once bowed to the likes of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. Under Eutropius, the Eastern court descended further into corruption and intrigue, while external threats, Goths, Huns, and Persians, grew ever more dangerous. Meanwhile, Stilicho and the West continued to bear the heavy responsibility of defending an empire that no longer possessed the strength of earlier centuries. His efforts to manage the Gothic threat and stabilize the Western provinces were hampered by constant suspicion from Constantinople, which saw him less as a guardian of imperial unity and more as an aspiring usurper. The chapter conveys a sense of tragic inevitability. Stilicho's virtues, instead of winning cooperation, provoked fear in the very empire he sought to preserve. As the historian turns his gaze across both halves of the empire, he reflects on the profound consequences of this division. The East, wealthy and fortified by its great capital, seemed destined for endurance, though not glory. The West, impoverished and increasingly exposed to barbarian encroachment, staggered toward its eventual collapse. Yet both shared a common flaw: emperors too weak to govern and ministers too ambitious to serve. In closing, the chapter laments the irony that Theodosius, who had restored unity through force and conviction, left behind an empire whose sons were incapable of preserving it. The division between Arcadius and Honorius marked not merely a political development, but the beginning of a permanent fracture. In its two halves lay the seeds of different destinies, one of survival, the other of ruin, and both were shaped by the interplay of incompetence, ambition, and the inexorable decline of Roman power. Chapter 30. The Revolt of the Goths. This chapter opens with the death of Theodosius, a moment that left the empire in the hands of two inexperienced sons and exposed the fatal weaknesses of the Roman state. The Goths, long settled within imperial borders as uneasy allies, quickly sensed the vacuum of authority. Their discontent, fueled by mistreatment, broken promises, and the weight of their own ambitions, ignited a revolt that would shake the foundations of the Western Empire. At the center of this storm stood Alaric, a man whose name would soon become inseparable from Rome's suffering, and whose career embodied the tragic interplay between barbarian valor and Roman decadence. Alaric had fought under Theodosius at the celebrated Battle of the Frigidus, where Gothic blood had been spent with reckless prodigality. The Goths, who had saved the empire on that desperate field, believed they had earned a permanent place and a voice within the empire's councils. Instead, they found themselves dismissed, their expectations ignored, and their loyalty taken for granted. Theodosius's heirs, Arcadius and Honorius, were children governed by ministers who understood little of the obligations owed to these formidable federates. Thus, when Alaric, smarting under the memory of unpaid service and unkept promises, raised the standard of revolt, he expressed not only personal ambition, but the collective grievance of his people. The Eastern court, ruled in name by Arcadius but in reality by his ministers, proved too feeble to contain the uprising. Alaric marched through Thrace and Macedonia with alarming speed, and soon set his sights on Greece, that sacred land of temples, libraries, and ancient glory. The historian lingers with melancholy over the spectacle of Gothic warriors descending upon Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Sparta, cities whose very names had once summoned the highest ideals of human achievement. Some were spared by negotiation, others suffered pillage or saw their proud monuments reduced to ruins. Yet, Alaric, though fierce, was not wantonly destructive. He sought a secure settlement and the recognition that Rome had long withheld. His measures, however violent, were the efforts of a people striving to extract justice through the only language the empire now seemed to understand. In this crisis, Stilicho emerged as the sole Roman figure whose abilities matched the danger at hand. Though a Westerner, he claimed a sweeping authority bequeathed by Theodosius himself, and he marched eastward to confront Alaric. Through strategic brilliance, he cornered the Goths in the peninsula of the Peloponnese. Yet, just when victory seemed in reach, Stilicho received an order from the Eastern government to withdraw. This command, born of court jealousy and fear of Stilicho's growing influence, effectively saved Alaric from destruction. The historian remarks with quiet indignation that the empire, twice endangered, first by its enemies, then by its own conspiracies, seemed determined to defeat itself. Alaric escaped and was soon appointed by the Eastern court as Master General of Illyricum. That the empire raised its most troublesome foe to high office reveals both its desperation and the fatal corruption of its politics. It was an act that gave Alaric legal authority, resources, and prestige, and transformed him into a statesman as well as a warrior. Still unsatisfied, he turned his ambitions westward, believing that Italy held the key to his people's future. The Western Empire, under Honorius, now faced the very adversary it had once allowed to grow strong through neglect and intrigue. At this moment, another barbarian king entered the narrative, Radagaisus, a far more brutal figure than Alaric. Leading a vast horde of Germanic warriors, he descended upon Italy with apocalyptic fury, proclaiming that Rome would be sacrificed to the gods of his ancestors. His advance threw the western provinces into panic. Honorius, timid and incapable, fled to the marsh-protected fortress of Ravenna, leaving Stilicho alone to answer the crisis. The general, gathering an improvised army of Romans, Huns, and Alans, confronted Radagaisus near Florence. Through discipline, strategy, and the advantage of terrain, he annihilated the barbarian host. Radagaisus himself was captured and executed. The victory was brilliant, yet its fruits soon rotted. Many survivors of the defeated horde slipped across Italy, selling their swords to other warlords and adding further chaos to an already unstable land. Despite Stilicho's triumph, suspicion haunted his every step. His foreign birth, his successes, and the loyalty he commanded among the troops stirred envy at court. Meanwhile, Alaric reappeared, demanding indemnities and territory as compensation for services rendered and grievances endured. Stilicho, understanding the empire's fragile condition, urged negotiation. But his enemies twisted every diplomatic gesture into evidence of treason. Honorius, easily manipulated, turned against the one man capable of saving his realm. In a tragic turn, Stilicho was arrested and executed, a decision as foolish as it was ruinous. With his death, the Western Empire lost its last competent guardian. The consequences were immediate. The barbarian auxiliaries who had served Stilicho were massacred or expelled by Roman officials acting in blind vengeance. Thousands fled to Alaric, swelling his ranks with bitter, experienced soldiers. What Rome lost in loyalty, Alaric gained in power. Now, unopposed by any general of ability, he marched across the Alps and descended upon Italy, no longer as a petitioner, but as an avenger. The first siege of Rome unfolded with a grim inevitability. The city, though still majestic in name, had long declined from its ancient strength. Its population was vast, its resources depleted, and its spirit weakened by luxury and dependence on distant provinces for food. When Alaric blockaded its ports, famine spread quickly. The Senate, torn between pride and desperation, negotiated terms that required enormous tribute. The city scraped together gold, silver, and sacred treasures, even stripping the statues of their ornaments to meet the demands. Alaric accepted the ransom but remained unsatisfied, for he was no nearer to obtaining the stable settlement he desired. Rome's agony did not end there. The Gothic king, frustrated by Honorius's refusal to negotiate, set up Attalus, a Roman noble, as a rival emperor. Attalus proved incompetent, and Alaric soon deposed him. Further embassies to Honorius met only with disdain. Thus came the third and final siege. Whether by treachery or despair, the Salarian Gate was opened, and Alaric entered Rome in the year 410, a date the historian treats with solemn reverence as the symbolic fall of the ancient world. Yet the sack of Rome, though shocking, was not the orgy of destruction often imagined. Alaric protected churches, spared many citizens, and allowed the city to be plundered for only 3 days. Still, the psychological blow was irreversible. For 8 centuries, Rome had stood unconquered. Now it lay humbled before a foreign king. Those who witnessed the event felt the old world tremble beneath their feet, as if the empire's spirit had departed. Shortly after, Alaric died unexpectedly while preparing a new expedition to Africa. His followers buried him beneath the diverted waters of a river, and then killed the captives who performed the labor, ensuring his grave would remain forever unknown, a fitting end for the man who had shaken the pillars of an empire. Thus, the chapter closes on a somber reflection. Rome fell not because its enemies were extraordinary, but because it had lost the virtues that had once made it formidable. Its generals were betrayed, its citizens softened, its politics corrupted, its soldiers faithless. The Goths, like a tempest, merely completed a ruin that Rome itself had long prepared. Chapter 31. The invasion of Italy and the occupation of the western provinces by the barbarians. In this chapter, the historian turns to one of the most catastrophic and revealing episodes in the decline of the Western Empire: the repeated invasions of Italy, the heartland of Roman power, and the tragic dismemberment of its western provinces at the hands of barbarian nations. The narrative unfolds like a grim procession in which the imperial government, drifting further into weakness and confusion, stands helpless before a series of calamities that seem to spring as much from its own folly as from the arms of its enemies. The death of Stilicho forms the somber threshold to these disasters. With that great general's fall, the Western Empire lost not only its most capable defender, but the last vestige of discipline in its military establishment. His execution, engineered by the petty jealousy and suspicion of Honorius's court, produced a shock whose consequences were immediate and fatal. The foreign auxiliaries who had served loyally under Stilicho were massacred in acts of blind vengeance or driven into exile. Thousands fled to Alaric, swelling his ranks with men who knew Roman tactics and Roman weaknesses. What Rome lost in loyalty, the Gothic king gained in strength. Thus, by a single act of ingratitude and fear, the empire armed its own destroyer. Alaric's second invasion of Italy followed swiftly. He marched with a purpose sharpened by Rome's betrayal and the grievances of his people. The Western Empire, deprived of strong leadership and riven by intrigue, could offer no resistance. Honorius remained secluded in Ravenna, a city protected by swamps but isolated from the reality of the danger. The imperial ministers, more concerned with courtly survival than with public safety, sent contradictory messages, refusing Alaric's moderate demands, then appealing for negotiations, then insulting his envoys. The historian notes with restrained bitterness that diplomacy conducted by cowards is little better than open warfare conducted by fools. Rome herself, still vast in population but empty of military force, became the unwilling stage of the unfolding tragedy. The first siege brought famine, despair, and humiliating negotiation. The Senate, that ancient body, now reduced to a shadow of its former majesty, struggled to preserve the city through tribute and apology. Though Alaric withdrew temporarily, he remained within striking distance, and the empire's indecision attempted to buy with words what its arms could no longer secure. The second siege deepened the sense of doom. Rome, starved and divided, watched Alaric establish Attalus as a puppet emperor, an experiment that revealed more about the vanity of Roman aristocrats than about any realistic political alternative. Attalus, raised by Gothic favor, soon proved incapable of command. He squandered opportunities, alienated allies, and, in the end, was abandoned by the very man who had elevated him. Alaric, disappointed but undeterred, once more demanded that Honorius engage in sincere negotiation. The emperor refused, trusting in the fortifications of Ravenna and in vague promises of eastern assistance. It was thus that the third siege began, the final act in a drama that had already stretched Rome's spirit beyond endurance. On a fateful August night, the Salarian Gate was opened, whether by treachery, desperation, or chance, and the Gothic host poured into the city. The sack of Rome, though restrained compared with the atrocities of other conquerors, nonetheless struck the world like a thunderbolt. For more than 8 centuries, Rome had stood unconquered, her walls never forced by a foreign enemy. The historian dwells on the symbolic weight of this moment. The eternal city, once mistress of nations, now lay helpless before a king of the Goths. Churches offered sanctuary, the great basilicas became islands of refuge in a sea of terror. Alaric allowed his troops 3 days to plunder, and though bloodshed was tempered, the shock to the Roman psyche was immeasurable. Yet even after sacking Rome, Alaric's designs remained surprisingly moderate. He wished not to annihilate Italy, but to secure lands for his people, a stable home where the Goths could live under his authority and with imperial sanction. When negotiations again failed, he moved southward, intending to cross into Africa, the grain-rich province whose capture would have placed the Western Empire at his mercy. But fate intervened. Alaric, in the midst of planning this new campaign, died suddenly in southern Italy. His followers, bound to him by a loyalty rare even among barbarians, diverted the course of a river to bury him beneath its bed, then killed the laborers to conceal the secret. A burial worthy of the man who had brought Rome to her knees. After Alaric's death, the Goths followed Aethelwulf, who led them northward into Gaul and eventually into Spain. But the historian emphasizes that their departure did not restore Italy's stability. The Western Empire, shaken to its core, now faced a new series of invasions even more complex and dangerous. For while Italy struggled under the weight of famine, depopulation, and ruined prestige, the frontiers of Gaul and Rhine burst open. It was during the same years that a flood of barbarian nations, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, and Burgundians, crossed the Rhine, driven partly by hunger, partly by internal pressures, and partly by the empire's obvious weakness. They overran Gaul, pillaged its cities, destroyed its countryside, and shattered its administrative structures. What had once been the fertile and prosperous heartland of the West descended into chaos. Some tribes pressed onward to Spain, where they carved out competing kingdoms. Others settled in Gaul itself, laying the foundations of future nations upon the ruins of Roman order. In this panorama of dissolution, the imperial government in Ravenna appeared powerless, distracted by petty intrigues, and incapable of confronting crises of continental scale. Usurpers rose in Gaul, local commanders declared independence, and the Western Empire shrank in authority until the emperor's rule extended little farther than the walls of Ravenna. The historian insists that these disasters were not merely the result of foreign invasion, but of the empire's internal decay, its corruption, its incompetence, its inability to produce leaders equal to the challenges of the age. The chapter concludes with a somber reflection. Italy, once the fortress of Roman power, had been invaded, humiliated, and left exposed. Gaul and Spain had been overrun and fragmented, and the empire that had ruled the world had now lost the very provinces that sustained its life. The barbarian nations did not rise because they were extraordinarily strong. They prevailed because Rome had grown overwhelmingly weak. The fall of the West was not a sudden catastrophe, but the natural consequence of years of misgovernment, moral decline, and the slow erosion of the institutions that had once made Rome invincible.